name's Colin Eberhardt, and I'm going to be talking about tools, bots, and automation for better open source projects. So, as is often the way, I want to tell you a little bit about myself. I've been writing software for a long time, as I'm sure some of you have. I was reminded of that quite recently in our company Slack channel. Someone pointed out that this thing, the Debug magazine, has been scanned, and I see a few happy faces here. Hands up if you had a BBC Micro. Oh, a few.
Yeah, on. Anyway, yeah, I used to have a BBC Micro years ago, and the Debug magazine was a sort of postal magazine for BBC Micro enthusiasts. And when this appeared online, I suddenly remembered, years ago, I'd written a letter to Debug magazine. So I spent the next probably 2 hours scrolling through pages and pages to see if I could find it. And I couldn't remember what it was. I was hoping it was going to be something quite insightful and awesome and pointing to a future career in software. And I found it. Dear sir, I've beaten the high score in Hedgehog. My score was 3,080. I like your magazine because it has lots of good games. Colin, aged 8. Yeah. I was pleased with that. Yeah.
So who did you charge the 2 hours to? Which client?
8. Yeah. I was at home. Honest, Gov. So anyway, one thing that struck me while I was scrolling through pages and pages of Debug magazine was just how much of this stuff there was. Lots and lots of source code. And funnily enough, my first experience with software and computing was very much about open source, because this was the only way to really ship your code to someone else. There were obviously a few commercial products at the time, but much of the software on the BBC Micro was open source and hand-coded by, well, copied, transcribed by people who got very used to syntax errors and things like that. And I guess that early experience in software probably defined the way that I've treated software ever since. I'm now incredibly active on GitHub. As Gab said, this is kind of your CV, so here's my wonderful CV. You can see that rash of green across the bottom means I spend far too much time doing open source stuff, and I'm a member of a number of organizations. And that is, again, because I see software very much as a craft, and one of the things that you do with craft is you share it. That's fundamentally what it's for. And yes, in my commercial career, we build software for our clients, but I still think there's a tremendous value in sharing your software. There was an announcement earlier by JP Morgan. They're open sourcing Perspective.js, which uses WebAssembly. One of my recent hobby projects is I've been contributing to a project called WebAssembly.js. I've been helping them come up with a standardized abstract syntax tree. Yeah, they're very geeky. It doesn't matter if you don't understand that, for WebAssembly. And it's a small contribution, but that little contribution has become part of Babel, which has become part of Webpack. And it may well actually be contributing to the JP Morgan project. I'm also a member of FINOS. Interestingly, Scott Logic isn't a member of FINOS. I'm the first community member, and they call it an at-large member. And I quite like that, because it makes it sound like I'm a criminal on the run. I'm still at large. Mao hasn't caught me yet. So anyway, yeah, I can run faster. So yeah, I'm the technology director at Scott Logic. We write lots of fancy software, lots of it involving open source. But today I want to talk about tools, bots, and automation. Now, I don't know how many of you have been in the earlier talks in this session. There's been some great stuff about licenses, about vulnerabilities. Really interesting talks, but this is kind of what my take-home impression of the talks so far this morning. There's been quite a lot of concern and fear about some of the bad things that can happen to you by entering into open source. I'm hoping that my talk is going to be a bit more like this. I want to look at the kind of the happier elements, the beneficial elements of working in open source. So, in common with some of the other presenters this morning, obviously I'm talking about tools and automation, and I'm treating it as a given that I don't have to convince you that automation is a good thing. We all know about DevOps, the coming together of development practices with operational practices, and developers through automation improving operations, and operations giving developers an understanding of what it's like to run software in production. It's a great concept. So why do we use DevOps? We use it for reproducibility, configuration as code. It reduces defects. It allows us to release with confidence. We use it for speed. Through test automation, we can deploy rapidly. We can reduce time to market. We use it for agility. This is actually, in the financial sector, I think one of the things they're most keen on is, with DevOps and cloud, is the ability to move more quickly than they have been able to in the past. And collaboration, faster resolution times. My cynical feeling is part of the reason why we use DevOps is because we've got this new thing called microservices, and it's impossible to use microservices without infrastructure as code. So, does automation ensure a quality product? Of course not. What ensures a quality product is that you hire technically able people. Not only do you hire technically able people, you influence their behavior by your culture. Some of it's cultural, some of it's probably contractual. This is imparted by the company through onboarding and so on. But in open source, one of the important things here is the cultural element is lost. You don't have, the people contributing to your project aren't part of your company. They haven't signed a contract. They're not in your building. They're not being influenced by your inherent culture, which is a significant challenge for open source. So what are these cultural challenges? Well, the thing is, you're working with a highly distributed team. And again, I'm working on the premise that you're open sourcing your code in the hope that others will contribute to it and make it better. You're working with a fluid and ever-changing team. So sometimes you'll have someone come along and make a large contribution and you might not hear from them ever again. A trickier challenge is you're working with people that have different levels of skill, different communication skills. They might not speak the same language as you, or they simply might not be terribly good at communicating. I've worked on open source projects where someone's just dumped a massive pull request, a big contribution, and they simply haven't explained why. You're also working with people that have got different needs, different goals, different ambitions. You construct a project because it fulfills one of your needs. The great thing about open source is you'll find other people who use your project for a completely different purpose. They have different needs, and that's a good thing, but again, it's a challenge. So, just for a bit of fun, I want to go talk about when open source goes bad. So grab your popcorn. There's some good ones here. Does anyone recognise this bit of code? JavaScript, that's a good start. I'll fill in the top bit, left pad. So you might have heard about this before. So it's 11 lines of code. Unfortunately, what happened is the developer behind it had a copyright or trademark disagreement with a company, and he was very upset about it, and it caused him to not just withdraw one of his packages, he withdrew all 250 of them. One of them was this 11 lines of code, which is downloaded 2.5 million times a month, and it broke everything. Babel, React, everything was broken as a result. I must admit, this is probably a good source of mockery from people that do C# and Java, that you have to have a package to be able to left pad a string. But yeah, that was interesting. Another one quite recently, Learner. Learn is a package, is a tool that allows you to manage multiple interdependent projects. One of the maintainers of this was particularly upset about a political issue and decided to update the MIT license to explicitly exclude the use of Learner by a whole host of companies like Microsoft Corporation, Amazon. Basically, they were saying, MIT license apart from you guys. Interesting. ESLint, this is very, very recent actually. What someone managed to do was they managed to steal the credentials of one of the maintainers and basically insert a virus which was immediately propagated to thousands of machines, and the whole idea behind the virus was it was intended to steal their credentials so that he could effectively spider out. It's all quite scary things. I guess the only conclusion I can really draw from this is people are a little bit unpredictable. Most of the activities you saw there, I guess apart from the last one, the people were doing what they generally thought was a good thing, fighting against political issues, or yeah, they thought they were doing the good thing, but you know, in practice, strange things happen when you move into the world of open source. So, what tools should you be equipping yourself with? Now, I could give you a huge list of tools and dump them on you, but what I want to do is look at the tools that will help you address some of these cultural challenges. So, distributed teams, fluid and changing team. What do these people fundamentally need from the project, and how can tooling help them? So, to do that, you have to put yourself in their shoes. So say, for example, you're trying to attract a contributor to your open source project. What are their needs? Firstly, understand the goals of your project so that their contributions are in line with your goals as well. And alignment means less friction. They want, in simple terms, they want to be able to rapidly clone and build your project locally. They want to test and verify changes. They don't want to spend too much time reading documentation, code style, naming conventions, that sort of thing. They also want rapid feedback. If they create a pull request, if they contribute code, if they write an issue, ideally they'd like a fairly quick response. They want to engage with you. Flip it round the other way. As a maintainer, what are my needs? As a baseline, it's the same as a contributor. Maintainers typically contribute as well, but there are a number of additional requirements they have. They want it to be easy to release, and as you probably know yourselves, often release processes are quite laborious. They want to communicate with and grow their community. They want to enforce license requirements. I'm not going to labour that point too much. We've had a bit of that this morning. They also want to manage dependencies and vulnerabilities. So, bring on the tools. What tools are there out there that can help us? So the first one, I was going to write this kind of like requirements style, but I got a little bit bored. But as a contributor, I want to easily test and verify my changes so that I can maximise the time I spend on feature development. I'm not going to do them all like that, don't worry. So, yeah, I want to easily test and verify my changes. How do we achieve that? The obvious thing is continuous integration, and continuous integration has been mentioned, I think, by every speaker this morning. And again, I don't think I have to sell the concept of continuous integration to you. But one thing to remind yourself is continuous integration is just the backbone. Continuous integration by itself doesn't actually do anything. It's the tools that you integrate with your continuous integration pipeline that actually bring you benefits. So the obvious one is running unit tests, which is these days considered standard hygiene for a project. The important thing is it gives both contributors and maintainers confidence. And I found this very, very useful actually when making a first contribution to someone else's open source project. You want to know, your understanding of that project initially is going to be fairly limited and minimal. If you can make a small change and then allow the unit tests to reassure you that you haven't broken anything, that's a massive benefit. And again, most internal projects that I've worked on don't have enough unit tests, and again, the culture of the environment props that up. You've got people either side of you to talk to work out whether you've done the right thing, whereas in open source, you don't have that. I want to rapidly clone and build locally. So there are a few things you need to do here. Firstly is use tools to manage your dependencies. Again, I think most people do this these days, but every language out there has some form of package manager. So again, historically, you quite often saw people taking their dependencies and copy them directly into their repository. You shouldn't really be doing that. There's things like npm, crates, CocoaPods, whichever language you're working with, it will have a mechanism for dependency management. The next thing, something I see people miss far too often, ensure your project is OS agnostic. And now, most people within financial services, they use Windows computers. Most people outside of financial services like Macs. Oh, break it. Go on, come back.
Yeah, but we deploy the line.
Yeah, phew. Very reliable Macintosh computers.
Gonna get it, yeah, it's out.
Oh, man. I'm not going to touch it. I'm just going to very gently. Yeah, so as I mentioned, most of you will probably have a Windows PC on your desk, but a lot of potential contributors, let's say, for example, you might be trying to attract a contributor from Facebook or Twitter. They'll probably have Mac computers. So it's very important, to my mind, to enforce the OS agnostic nature of your project through continuous integration. So you can do that by having Windows builds, by having Linux builds, because probably yourself, you might not want to switch between different OSs as you're developing. Another thing is consider tools like Docker. If your open source project has dependencies on databases and services, don't give someone a huge long list of how to install these different things. Give them a Docker image so they can get up and running quickly. Again, reducing the time from checking out a project to be able to make a meaningful change is very, very important for attracting first-time contributors. I don't want to spend time reading about code style, naming conventions, etc. Yeah. Just have a drink. We've all heard about the big kind of spaces versus tabs debate, and that is the tip of the iceberg. Anything that you can stylistically change in a language, people will argue about. It's the way it is. So how do we tackle that? Now, the current tools we use to tackle that are, in my opinion, not very good. They're typically enforced by static code analysis. So you will have, within your continuous integration pipeline, you'll have static code analysis which will say, yes, they're using tabs, great. Or, yes, they've got 2 spaces between, I don't know, this and that. And sometimes people try to support it by providing an editor configuration. So they might give you a configuration for Visual Studio so that you can automatically format. But there are a few problems with that approach. Firstly, it doesn't support multiple editors. So again, you're assuming that a contributor has the same environment as yourself. They might be wanting to use, I don't know, Vi or Visual Studio Code or Atom or something else. So having a single editor configuration is not very useful. Also, it catches the problem late on. You're giving someone a slap after they've done all this hard work for not following your conventions. Some static analysis tools, some linters have a fix mode, but typically they can't fix and resolve everything. So in the JavaScript world, where I think a lot of the creativity is going on these days, there's a new tool called Prettier, and it has some very, very interesting features. One of the most interesting features from my perspective is it's a reformatter. So it's not there to slap you on the wrist if you get it wrong. What it does is it takes all of your code and transforms it into an abstract syntax tree, so that's a tree-like representation of your code, and then spits it back out as JavaScript following their predefined conventions. So what that means is there's nothing to check. It's reformatted everything for you in an entirely reproducible fashion. It's opinionated as well. It's not designed to be configured. The ethos behind this project is we've made a few decisions. To be honest, code style isn't worth arguing about. It's a waste of time. Follow this convention and off we go. And a lot of big companies have now adopted it. And obviously it can be run on CI and editor. So this means the problem's caught earlier on. But you can actually catch it sooner than that. So something that a lot of people don't use is Git hooks. So with Git, you can actually execute scripts at the point of check-in. And one of the reasons people don't use Git hooks is they're actually quite hard to configure. And there are open source tools, Husky's a good one, which make it a lot easier to configure Git hooks. The problem with Git hooks is the hooks themselves aren't part of the clone process, so you have to manually add the Git hooks. So Husky and various other tools make sure that this happens post-installation. Basically, it automates the whole thing. In a nutshell, these 6 lines of code will mean that, in this example, Prettier will be run every time someone commits code. So the whole argument about code style goes away. Also, by having code style enforced in this fashion, it means diffs are easier to follow. It's highly frustrating when someone makes a contribution and they add value in maybe 10 lines of code, but then they change 50 files just because they've got a different editor configuration. Big waste of time. As a contributor, I want rapid feedback on issues. This can actually be really, really challenging. I think this is one of the biggest challenges in open source. It's challenging in so many different contexts. Your open source project could be a hobby project that you don't have much time for. Or, on the flip side, you might be Facebook or Microsoft. You might have a project like React or Visual Studio Code, where every day there are hundreds and hundreds of people raising issues. So tackling this is a big problem. This is where bots are actually quite useful. There are a number of different bots that you can find on the web. An interesting project is Probot. It's a framework for building bots, and it's also effectively a marketplace for bots. So I'm just going to show you a couple of the bots that I've used in the past that I think are quite useful. The first one is one that basically looks, when people raise issues, it looks at the description of the issue and determines whether you need to request more information. And this is a very common problem. Asking people, what version are you using, or can you please elaborate? This bot will take away some of that drudgery. Also, I think there are opportunities here to do things like welcome new users. As an example, you'll often have a code of conduct, and to be honest, most people will never read it. But if at the point when someone opens an issue or a pull request, you say, oh, by the way, thanks for your contribution, would you mind reading the code of conduct? It gives them something useful to do and gives you a bit more time to actually look at their contribution. Another one is When you merge pull requests, you can add a message, for example. Maybe a shocked cat's not the best way to use this, but maybe a more productive thing to do would be to set expectations about review timing. You could have the bot up front tell them, by the way, this is a side project of mine. It might take me a week to get back to you. And setting expectations will mean it is much better for both the contributor and the maintainer. And they've got loads more bots, things like work in progress, to do. And the great thing with the ProBot framework is, as well as giving you a framework to build bots, they also host them as well. So you don't have to deploy these on your own infrastructure. As a maintainer, I want to easily release updates so I can do better things with my time. Releases are complex. Releases are sometimes the most challenging thing you have to do as someone who's managing a project. You might have to deploy to servers if you're running as a service. You release to repositories or CDNs. You typically have some closing of issues, tagging, branch twiddling. You might have to close a bunch of branches. You have to increment version numbers. You have to communicate changes. There's a lot of stuff you have to do, and it's a pain. One of the tools that I've found really quite useful recently is a thing called Semantic Release, and I'll explain it in a little bit more detail because it's quite tricky to get your head around. The first thing it relies on is a thing called semantic versioning. Just out of interest, hands up if you know what semantic versioning is. Okay, loads. Do you want to explain, Patrick? Okay, so yeah, semantic versioning is basically a set of rules about how you manage version numbers and which ones you increment. It's a very useful tool to use, although there's a lot of ambiguity in practice. So with semantic release, it combines two concepts: semantic versioning and the concept of semantic commit messages. A lot of commit messages that you see will be next to useless, one-liners, and sometimes they put a lot of superfluous detail. Coming up with a good commit message is actually quite challenging. Semantic commit messages have a set of rules about how you should construct your commit message. So, for example, the first few characters are the type. Is it a chore? Is it a documentation update? Is it a feature? Is it a fix? There's conventions for indicating breaking changes. So it provides a good set of rules about your commit messages. Semantic release combines these all together. So commit messages dictate the version number. So what it can do is it can look at your commit history at the point you merge a branch, look at all the semantic messages, and work out which of the 3 version numbers to increment. It will tag your repository. It will generate release notes. And again, those release notes are generated from your semantic commit messages. It will deploy packages to GitHub as zip files, to NPM and other package managers. And the great thing is, it allows continuous deployment of libraries and frameworks, which is something that not many people do. We've got an open source project at Scott Logic we've been maintaining for a while, and we actually practice continuous deployment, which means every time we make a change, we release, because it's easy now. And why wouldn't you? Manage vulnerabilities, licenses, yeah, all that good stuff. I'm not going to labor this too much because most of the speakers this morning have covered this topic. But the issues you're mainly concerned with are my dependencies up to date? Are there vulnerabilities that affect me? Have I violated license terms and so on? Yeah, we're getting depressing again, aren't we? Are my dependencies up to date? Jamie, I think it was from GitHub, pointed out this one, Greenkeeper. So what Greenkeeper does is it looks at all your dependencies, and every time it sees a new release of one of these dependencies, it creates a branch in your repository, runs your tests, and lets you know whether it's safe to merge. It's a nice idea in practice, but to be perfectly honest, I haven't found it terribly useful. It creates a lot of noise. Personally, a lot of the issues I find are semantic versioning has a set of rules, but the rules themselves have a large amount of ambiguity. What someone might consider to be a bug, you might consider to be a feature. And if you disagree about that, tools like Greenkeeper aren't going to help you. I generally prefer to pin version numbers and only update my dependencies when I need to. Because oftentimes, if you just go for automatic updating and you've got a large number of dependencies, you'll find it just breaks. So yeah, it might work for you, to be honest. Have there been any disclosed vulnerabilities? And again, there are lots of products out there. Snyk is yet another one. Again, it will do the usual thing. It will keep an eye on your dependencies. If anything has been disclosed, it will inform you, in this case via GitHub. Have I violated any of my license terms? Again, there are lots and lots of products out there. Within Scott Logic, actually, for a bit of fun, we created a little tool that would crawl all the dependencies of a package on NPM. So that's the JavaScript repository. And as you'll have seen from LeftPad, JavaScript applications are generally built up of thousands of very, very little parts. And unfortunately, a lot of the problems you have with vulnerabilities, licenses, and so on are massively inflated in the JavaScript world. So we built this little tool, and this is looking at Electron, which is a HTML5 container. And you can see all the different licenses in the blue pills. I know it's not terribly readable. All the blue pills at the top tell you all the different licenses that have occurred in the 1,000 dependencies of Electron. And funnily enough, we found this thing called JSONify at the bottom, which doesn't have a license at all. And if you know anything about licensing, all you've got to do is Google this. If something doesn't actually express a license, you cannot use it. So version 1.8.2 of Electron, you can't use it. It's a bit crazy. The funny thing is, if you look at JSONify, it gets worse. It's actually, in the documentation for the project, it says, this is some code that was created by Douglas Crockford that I've copied, pasted, put on GitHub, and released. Marvelous. Yeah, I must admit, I think people are turning a blind eye to this. It's a difficult problem, but yeah. I'm not going to go into that. OK. The final thing I wanted to talk about is I want to enforce my license requirements. And that's something that hasn't been covered this morning. A lot of what's been talked about is the license of the things you depend on. I'm talking about as someone who's maintaining an open source project, I want to be sure that contributions from third parties are fit for purpose and I can use them. So as a contributor, I want to ensure that a contributor is authorized to submit that piece of work. And I also want to ensure that my project can then distribute their work. And there are a couple of different ways of doing this. One of them is a contributor license agreement. So that's where you invite all contributors to sign a legal agreement which basically enforces those two principles. There's another one which is a more lightweight approach called a developer certificate of origin. Most large enterprises opt for the CLA, the contributor license agreement. I believe it's a bit more watertight. Unfortunately, both require significant overhead. Every single contribution, every single commit requires you to check that either the CLA or the DCO has been signed. And when I first started working with FINOS, back when it was called Symphony Foundation, they didn't actually have an existing mechanism to enforce this check. So they had a number of open source projects on the website, and I believe someone was having to manually check the commits. And I thought, let's have a look, see if there are any tools out there. And what I found was there weren't any tools that actually worked for FINOS. The problem is, you're tackling two things. The first thing is you need a process to allow people to sign a legal agreement, and then you need the boring mechanical process that just checks all the commits against a list of people who have signed. And there were already frameworks and bots and tools out there that did both. But the problem with contributor license agreements is they're often quite bespoke. As an example, I checked JP Morgan's this morning when they were talking about perspective. Their CLA approach involves printing a document, signing it, and emailing it to someone. Everyone has a slightly different approach. So to my mind, the only way to really make this work would be to decouple the two. Allow each institution, organization, to manage how CLA signing is performed, and then create a bot that checks against a whitelist of contributors. So that's yet another one of my hobby projects that I built. And the great thing is, it's used by FINOS, and within about 6 months, I've got quite a lot of other users. Gauge is a ThoughtWorks project. Predix are using it for their style guides. DevColor, Gladios, Storage, Skylight. There are quite a lot of people using this little bot that I created now, which is it's a great feeling. So what happens is, whenever someone creates a pull request, the bot pops up and says, oh, by the way, you need to sign this contributor license agreement. So again, it's a very friendly way of enforcing this legal requirement. So yeah, finally to wrap up. Use automation to make life easier for contributors and maintainers. There are a lot of good tools out there. I've only really scratched the surface. But again, rather than looking for shiny tools, don't do that. Think about the requirements and the needs of the contributor and the maintainer, and then find tools that fit. They allow you to reduce your maintenance overhead and allow you to focus on the real problem, the real business value, which is building a great library or a framework or a tool. And if a suitable tool doesn't exist, build it and open source it, as I did with the CLA bot. One other thing I learned from doing the CLA bot and a few other open source projects is it can be a bit lonely doing open source at times. You create something and you sit there and you think, no one's using it, no one's saying anything. And the interesting thing is you only find a lot of your users when you actually break it. It's quite good fun. I've had a few projects where I've, unbeknown to me, broken something. Flood of issues. Never heard anything from these people in the past, but all of a sudden they all want to shout at me. So yeah. So basically, if you, as a take-home message, if you use anything on GitHub, hit the star button. It makes people happy. But final thoughts though. Open source software is built by people, and I've talked a lot at the beginning, or a bit at the beginning, about the culture. Now these tools will help you a little bit with the culture, but you can only go so far with tools and bots and automation. What I've found quite useful are collaboration tools, things like Slack, Skype, Hangouts. It's a little bit weird when you end up on meetings, and I guess with FINOS we do this as well. We have a distributed team of people, often who have not met each other. And it can be a little bit weird at first, but there's a huge amount of benefit to actually talking to people, face-to-face, or at least through video calls. I've had a chat with people in the Babel team, for example. It's a bit funny at first, but it means you can discuss some of the things like your needs, your motivations, your personal situation, which will really help when that person comes to contribute, or vice versa. So tools are great, but do not forget the human element. And that's it. So hopefully that's been useful to you, and good luck with your projects. So yeah, if anyone's got any questions, as long as they're not about security or licenses. Right, yeah.
Actually, two if I may. I'm sure I remember talking about semantic versioning.
Yeah.
I'm sure there are people here who use the Selenium WebDriver.
Oh yeah.
A friend of mine is the head developer of Deliveroo. You should check out today's version, which is version 3.14.159.
Oh,
Quite deliberate.
Pi. Yeah. There are some quite esoteric version numbering. I can't remember which project it is, whether it's Linux or something. There is one where every new release they just add another digit, and they're heading towards pi. So are they using pi versioning as well? No, it's just coincidental. Yeah. That's called romantic versioning. So go.
Any viewpoint yet on GitHub Actions and what effect?
Ah, yeah. The great thing about GitHub Actions was I actually started building something which looked a bit like GitHub Actions, and I was really annoyed when GitHub Actions appeared, because when I wrote the CLA bot, I realized that the vast amount of what I was doing was fundamentally plumbing. And actually, if we go back to back, a lot of these featured apps here, things like work in progress, all that does is it checks the title of a pull request, and if it has the characters WIP in it, it prohibits a merge. It's an if, this, else, that. You can express it in 5 lines of code. So I did start trying to create a sort of live coding environment where you could construct automations, but then I found out that GitHub had done it. So yeah, I think it's a wonderful idea, basically. Anyone?
Sorry.
Are you going to add another digit now? 3.14159?
The point about getting response very quickly is very important. I know we'll work at different time zones, because that's important. But I had a case that I participated in the Julia language, and you're talking about Linux and Windows. There's a certain package which installed and built on Linux doesn't install on Windows.
Yeah.
And I did a little bit of work in trying to figure out why that was. I submitted an issue on it, and 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks later, the person replied to the issue, and that just, if the person had replied quickly, we could have entered into a productive, let's get this fixed. But by the time through 2 weeks is elapsed, you've completely forgotten about it. You can't be bothered anymore with it.
The guy I sit next to at work, I think probably holds the record for this. He submitted a fix to Google Closure, and he didn't hear back from them for 2 years. And eventually he got what was quite a grumpy code review from someone 2 years later. And to his credit, he actually installed all the tools again. He couldn't remember what it was he'd done, but he actually worked with this guy to finally get his code merged. But yeah, 2 years is a...
Closure can be a bit head twisting at times.
Yeah, it's a funny thing. Anyone else? Or are we done for time?
Well, yeah, we're okay.
Oh, what? Go on then. One more question.
The
Go,
question is okay. I can start plugging my laptop for the next.
yeah, any more questions, or are you?
But
Go on.
specific, but sorry. Trying out atomist. Any view on that?
Atomist.
Concept of I think what they're trying to do is, the argument is that a pipeline isn't distinct to a repository, and often you would have the same pipeline that applies across hundreds.
Oh, right, it's the same CI pipeline.
Yeah, yeah.
That's
So
interesting.
it's a little bit different to GitHub Actions, where the workflow is linked to the repository one-to-one.
Yeah, I've not had a go with Atomist. I've seen it's a commercial product, isn't it, Atomist?
I think the company is founded by one of the
Johnson's project.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I don't know much about that. But I mean, anything that can make automation and CI tooling is better.
It's interesting, but I was just wondering if anybody had experience with it.
No, I've not used it. No. Cool. All right then. Has Mal disappeared? Must be getting the next speaker. All right. Thanks very much for listening, everyone.